This is a familiar passage, no doubt to many of you. In Matthew chapter 9, I'd like to read as our text. And there are a lot of different things that could be said about this passage, a lot of different messages that could be preached. And I want to focus on a certain aspect of it that has struck my heart as I've tried to study and prepare for this message. We're going to start in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, in verse 18, and we'll read down through verse 26. So this is right after Jesus had spoken with John the Baptist's disciples, who would come to him and ask that question about why they fasted, and the Pharisees fasted, but Jesus and his disciples did not fast. In fact, they had been at a feast with Matthew and his friends. And that was a whole nother discussion. But Jesus taught them about putting new wine into old wineskins and how that doesn't work. And so now, after that, something else happens. And it's not so much Jesus teaching and answering a question, it's Jesus doing things. But by what he does, we learn something important. And so it says, while he spake these things unto them, behold, there came a certain ruler and worshipped him, saying, My daughter is even now dead. But come and lay thy hand upon her, and she shall live. And Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment. For she said within herself, If I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole. But Jesus turned him about, and when he saw her, he said, Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. And the woman was made whole from that hour. And when Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the minstrels and the people making a noise, he said unto them, Give place, for the maid is not dead, but sleepeth. And they laughed him to scorn. But when the people were put forth, he went in and took her by the hand, and the maid arose, and the fame hereof went abroad into all the land. So in that passage there in Matthew chapter 9, we see something starting, and then we see an interruption, and then we see it continuing. And I want to give a little bit of context because this event is covered in 3 different Gospels in the same order: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All 3 cover this event. And we learn some additional things about what's going on in those other Gospels I want to bring in just to give a little bit more light. First of all, this guy who came to Jesus, his name was Jairus. He was the ruler of the synagogue there in Capernaum. So he was the chief Jewish religious figure in that place where Jesus was using kind of as his home base. And it was his daughter who was dying, and she was 12 years old. Matthew's record of this event is the shortest by far. It's about either a third to a half of the length that Mark and Luke record. So they give a lot more detail. I'm not wanting to preach Mark's or Luke's account of this. I want to preach Matthew's, but I'm just bringing that up because there's a little bit more detail that might help us understand what's going on a bit more. But all 3 of them recorded in this way. Jairus comes, and he is asking for Jesus to help his daughter. Jesus is going, but there is this woman who comes and touches him, so that trip is interrupted. And then after that all happens there with that woman, then he goes to Jairus' daughter. And so this is exactly how this happened. There was a disruption in the trip. Okay? And what we see, first of all, when we come to this passage, I want us to look at the first couple of verses here, verses 18 and 19, about Jairus kneels. We see that when he came to Jesus, this certain ruler came, it says he worshiped him. It means literally he knelt down before Jesus Christ. He got on his knees before Jesus, and he reverenced Jesus as a superior. This was the chief Jewish religious leader in that community, and he, who was used to being respected, used to being the one everybody came to for guidance, advice, wisdom, he got on his knees before Jesus Christ. It is a big deal that Jairus even came to Jesus, because a lot of these Jews were kind of, hedging their bets, not too sure. Eventually if people professed Jesus, they were put out of the synagogue. That was later. At this point, he was a ruler of the synagogue. So to go to Jesus with a problem itself was significant, but to go and to kneel before Jesus, that's huge. Because he is not just going and saying, what's your opinion? Can you do something for me? He is kneeling, prostrating himself before Jesus Christ, and he is saying, I need you. I need you. You can do what I cannot do. You are greater than me. He had clearly heard about Jesus. Jesus had spent a lot of time in Capernaum. He had preached. He'd done miracles there. All of this came to Jairus. All this was part of what he was aware of, okay? And no doubt he was pondering in his heart who this Jesus was, thinking about it back and forth, never necessarily landing on it. But this event with his daughter's sickness. In fact, when you read Mark and Luke's gospel, they tell us that when he came, she was near death, and that on the trip back, at some point, she died, and when they came back, she was dead. Matthew's just kind of consolidated all of this. He's condensed it, okay? It was his daughter's fatal illness that pushed him over the edge to come to Jesus. He was at his wit's end to be able to do anything to help his daughter. He loved his daughter, and he was willing to go to Jesus and kneel before Jesus because of a series of events. And we learned the first thing tonight is that sometimes it takes an extremity to break us loose, doesn't it? Sometimes it takes something hard. We think about Jesus, we think about our need for him, this, that, and the other. But sometimes it takes something really hard to just break us to the point where we see, I need Jesus. I need Jesus. And when he came to Jesus, he had heard enough, he had seen enough, that he had enough faith to believe that Jesus could take care of this problem. Jesus could heal her, he could raise her. And we see that as this man who, I don't know if he'd ever spoke to Jesus before, but when he came to Jesus, Jesus responded to his faith. Jesus didn't stand back aloof and say, well, it's about time. You've been thinking about this for a while. He didn't play with him, none of that. When Jesus saw this man's faith and his request, will you come to touch my daughter? Put your hand on my daughter and she will be healed, she'll be raised. Will you come and do this? Jesus got right up to go and follow Jairus to take care of his daughter. He responded to her faith. You see, Jesus makes himself available to us when we cry out to him in faith, right? You think about the centurion. We talked about him several weeks ago. The centurion was a Gentile, and he had a servant who was really sick, on the edge of death, right? And he came to Jesus and asked Jesus to heal him, but did Jesus go? Jesus was going to go with the centurion, and the centurion said, you don't need to go. You don't need to come in my house. I'm not worthy. I'm a Gentile. You're a Jew. You guys don't come into our house. You just say the word. You just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus said, I've not seen that much faith in any of the Israelites, any of the Jewish people. I've not seen that much faith. And Jesus said, as you've asked, so is it. And that man's servant was healed right there. You see, Jesus didn't have to go to Jairus' house to raise her daughter. He could have just spoken a word. But this is where Jairus was at. He said, I need you, Jesus, to come and lay your hand on her. But what Jesus saw was his faith. Maybe his faith wasn't of the same exact kind as the centurion's faith, but he saw faith. And Jesus came and met him right where he was at. And he brought his disciples with him and said, I will come. And he gathered his disciples, and they began this journey to go to Jairus' daughter, to heal her, to raise her, to do those things that were needed. But here we have a disruption, and this is what Brother Kenny was singing about tonight. While he was walking to that house, or going, I don't know if they were running, what was happening, but they were moving towards Jairus' house. And here, behold, a woman who was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came from behind Jesus and touched the hem of his garment, because she said inside her heart, this is not something she had vocalized, didn't tell all her friends, but this is what she had in her heart. If I could just touch the hem of his garment, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I will be whole. I will be healed. I just need to touch him. And she did reach out and touch the hem of his garment. And when that happened, Jesus perceived it. She came up behind him, not in front of him, touched the edge of his garment. And what we learned from Mark's account and Luke's account was that there was a crowd of people. A lot of people gathered around, and so Jesus and his disciples were working their way through rush hour in Capernaum of people all around them. No doubt people pressing and touching all over the place. In fact, when this woman came up from behind and touched the edge of his garment, Jesus stopped and said, hey, whoa, virtue has gone out of me. Virtue has gone out of me. Somebody's touched me. And his disciples are like, everybody's touching you. I mean, you're in a mass of people, pressing through a whole bunch of people. What do you mean somebody touched you? But Jesus had perceived that someone had touched him, not just a shoulder bump and nudge, but someone had reached out and touched him in faith. And that woman, as she had believed when she put her faith in Christ and touched the hem of his garment, she was healed that very moment. And there Jesus turns, and when he saw her, and he knew who it was, and she admitted that, he said, daughter, be of good comfort. Your faith, it's made you whole. It's made you well. And from that moment, she was whole. That issue of blood she'd had for 12 years. What was going on there? Well, we had this interruption. Whatever's going on with Jairus' daughter is put on hold for a moment. Because this woman, who had suffered from an issue of blood, a constant bleeding, for 12 years, came to Jesus needing his help. I thought it's interesting to me as I was studying this that this girl was 12 years old. That was Jairus' daughter, who was dying and was dead by the time Jesus got there. She was 12 years old. And this woman had this bleeding for 12 years. So every moment of that young girl's life that she had, that Jairus was raising her and he was around her, this other woman was suffering. She was suffering from this issue of blood. And this bleeding that she had in the Jewish culture, according to the Old Testament, she was ritually unclean and socially unclean. When this was going on, you couldn't go into this temple worship and take part in that. You couldn't be out around people, right? You had to isolate yourself. And so I don't know how much of this she was observing or how much she let be known, but she was religiously and socially an outcast. And in reality, when she was coming up in the press of a crowd to come behind Jesus and touch the edge of his garment, what was she doing to everybody else around her? Making them unclean. If they had known, right? This unclean person is pressing up against me, touching me. Now I'm unclean because they're unclean and I've touched them. In fact, interesting as well is that this young girl died and Jesus came and took her hand and healed her. A dead body, was also unclean to the Jewish people. Jesus was not afraid to reach into the unclean and to make them clean. So pressing through the crowd for this woman was a risk. It was a risk to go to Jesus like this. And the Bible tells us in Mark that she had wasted all of her resources on doctors. Any kind of cure she could find. She spent every bit of money she had. Mark says wasting them on doctors. Luke, who was a doctor, said she was incurable. Okay? He had a little bit different perspective. He didn't say she wasted her money on doctors. He just said she was incurable. But she had spent all of her resources. She had nothing else, no other way to get this problem solved in her heart. And here she heard about Jesus. She saw perhaps some of the evidence of what he's done. And she just says, I just need the edge of his garment, the hem of his garment. What is this hem that they're talking about here? Because this is actually a specific thing. You see, in the Old Testament, the Jewish people were told to sew tassels, 4 tassels exactly, to be sewn on the bottom of their garment. Here is the prescription in Numbers 15, 38 through 39. It says, speak unto the children of Israel and bid them that they make fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue, and it shall be unto you for a fringe. So the Lord is telling the Israelites, for all your generations, you all are to wear something special on the bottom of your garments. These would be blue tassels, so that you may look upon it when you see those things hanging off your garment. This is a different way that you all Israelites are going to dress than everybody else. When you see that and you look on it, you will remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes. And so the Lord wanted the Israelites to have a constant visual reminder that God gave them a law, and they were to obey this law. And all the Jewish people throughout all the generations wore it, and there's no reason to believe that Jesus was any different. In fact, we know the Pharisees liked to make their tassels really large because they wanted to say, we are really aware of God's law and we are really committed to doing it, right? That they actually physically made their tassels larger to make sure the other Jews knew how committed they were. That's what she was reaching to touch on Jesus' garment. It's interesting, Jairus wanted Jesus to lay his hand on his daughter. This woman said, I just need to touch the hem of his garment. You see, if we try to get into ritualistic things, this or that's the way you come to Jesus, I think we lose the point. The point is this: while their methods were slightly different and how they were going to get what they needed, their intent was the same. I need Jesus. I need Jesus. However, wherever, I need Jesus. And Jesus met them right there, exactly where they were at that point of their need. And when this woman touched Jesus, it could have been that she was just healed and Jesus just goes on. But what we see happening is that Jesus actually stops. He stops. I mean, he was on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, and then he stopped because he knew he was touched. He cared about this woman. He cared about her suffering. He addressed her as daughter. He saw her faith. He healed her in that moment, and it stopped that trip. And this created a pause. This created a pause. And I want to focus on this for just a few minutes tonight and think about this. Because during this journey and this delay, Jairus' 12-year-old daughter died. During this journey and this delay, she died. And this isn't the only time that something like this has happened with Jesus. This isn't the only time. There was a delay between the news of Lazarus' illness in the Gospel of John. When Jesus heard, it was told to him that Lazarus was sick, come and heal him. And Jesus, after getting that news, he waited. He waited, I think, a couple days. And then he went with his disciples to go to Lazarus. But things got worse because of the delay, and Lazarus died. And when Jesus arrived and Lazarus was already in the tomb, both Martha and Mary came to Jesus with the same refrain: If you had been here, you could have healed him, and this never would have happened, Jesus. If you were here, we sent word for you. We wanted you to know he was sick. We wanted you to show up and do something so that he wouldn't die. You didn't come. There was this pause. There was this delay. And now he's dead. Something kind of similar, I believe, was with the man that was born blind, that was healed during Jesus' ministry when he was in Jerusalem. This man had been blind from his birth. He was a Jewish man. His family was part of the Jewish synagogue. And it's hard for me to imagine that during the course of that man's life, through his childhood and all those other things, it's hard to imagine that his parents wouldn't have prayed for him. Give him his sight back. Let him see something, Lord. I mean, who wouldn't pray for that, right? I mean, many of us, we've had kids or situations, and what do we do when something arises? Even if it seems impossible, right? I remember when Josiah was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is technically incurable. I got down on the floor and I was praying, God, heal him. I know you can. Heal him. I think we probably all prayed and things like that and not seen the results, the answers of the prayer. Jesus later healed that man during his ministry, but there were the years of darkness, right? But because of this pause, because of this girl's sickness, Jairus came to Christ, right? It was because she became ill, and no doubt Jairus had been thinking, who is Jesus? Do I trust him? Do I not? What are people going to think? I don't know this. I don't know that. Is he the Messiah? Is he not? But my friend, when his daughter got to that place and she was about to die, it didn't matter what everybody else thought. All he knew was that this Jesus could take care of something, and Jairus came to Christ. No doubt he had prayed to God for her illness to be reversed. As a head of a synagogue, wouldn't a man like that pray? Don't you think as soon as she became ill and all this was going on, don't you think he prayed? God didn't answer that prayer until he broke and he came to Christ. Because of that situation, because of his daughter's illness, as he came to call upon Jesus to come to heal his daughter, because of that, Jesus walked by this woman who was healed. There's no indication that this woman knew Jairus' daughter, that she had any sense that their lives were connected in this way, but they have been eternally connected, haven't they? Because of that situation, because Jesus was passing by that way, she was able to reach out and touch the hem of his garment. When it comes to Lazarus, you see, Lazarus died so that he could be raised from the dead. There was a reason for the pause. There was a reason that Jesus Christ waited before coming to Lazarus, because that was part of God's plan. Jesus told his disciples before they even went back to where Lazarus was, he told them, he says, Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. Jesus told those disciples, I am glad that I was not there and that he died, so that when I go and do what I'm about to do, you may believe. You see, to Jesus, the death of Lazarus was worth their growth in faith. The death of Lazarus was an appropriate price to pay for their faith to grow. Because that blind man was not healed, perhaps when his parents first prayed for him as a child, he was healed publicly, wasn't he? He was healed publicly. You see, Jesus' disciples asked Jesus when they saw the blind man, they said, why is he blind? Who sinned? Who did something wrong? Was it him? Was it his parents? Why has this bad thing happened? Somebody must have done something wrong. And Jesus said, it's none of that. It's not because he sinned or that his parents sinned. I mean, they were, yes, all sinners, but there was not one sin that caused this event. Jesus explained, he said, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but here's the purpose. This is why that man was born blind. That the works of God might be displayed in him. You see, manifesting the power of God and the compassion of Christ was worth the years of darkness. You see, in each and every case, just like when Jesus will finally get to Jairus' daughter here, in each and every case, there was a glorious purpose. There was a purpose in the pause, a purpose in the delay between the prayer request and the answer to the prayer. There was a reason. There were things God was doing and that God was accomplishing. You see, because God's vantage point, I mean, we are so earthbound and our eyes just tend to look around to what we see and what we can feel and what's all right in front of us. And we value those things so much. And we often lose sight of how precious and important the spiritual things are, right? The things that are of most value to God, the things that God really cares about, the things that will last forever. You know, that fruit that will endure we talked about this morning. The Lord says, I have chosen you that you might produce fruit, and that fruit would remain and endure. God has chosen us and given us an opportunity to live lives that matter, but it requires what? Faith. It requires love. It requires growth. It requires us getting beyond the way we naturally are to love and trust Him more. It requires those things, and the only way that we get there oftentimes is the difficulty. It's the pauses. It's the situations that make us quit hedging our bets on how much do I trust Christ and how good is He really, and just bring us to the place where we're on our knees before God and saying, I need you, I need you, I need you. And then right then He shows up and we see that it was worth it. I mean, how many of us, and I've asked this question before, how many of you who are saved, who know Christ, maybe some of you got saved the first time you prayed, and some of you, like me, I sought for quite a while before I got saved. But does anybody regret the seeking? Oh, I mean, it was painful, wasn't it? It was hard. It was hard to feel after the Lord. It was hard to be discouraged at times and say, why aren't you answering my prayers? But when God brings you to that place where He helps you to put your trust in Him and you turn from sin and you look to Him, my friends, the joy of that new birth makes all the pain of labor seem like nothing. Doesn't it? There was even purpose in the pause. Because He was bringing us to the end of ourselves. And even in those things, He can use that. He can use that in some way. You see, our greatest need is to know God and to love God. And our greatest purpose is to behold Him and to glorify Him. And that is worth pain. And it's worth a pause at times between the things we ask for and then receiving them. And that's hard for us. It's hard for me. But I believe it's true, and we see that. I believe there is a reason that every Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these three of these four Gospels record this the exact same way. There was this interruption. And the end of the matter when Jesus gets there is worse than when He was first asked to come. But in that pause, He was doing all of these things, and that's just what we can see. You see, as we get to the end of this passage here, Jesus never forgot Jairus' request. And when Jesus came into the ruler's house, And he saw the minstrels and the people making a noise. This was a funeral procession. He said to them, "Give place, stop it, because she's not dead, but she's sleeping." And they laughed him to scorn. But when the people were put forth and he sent them out, he went in and he took her by the hand, and the maid arose, and the fame hereof went broad into all the land. He came personally. And he did lay his hand on her, and he grabbed her by the hand, and she came right up out of that bed, and she was fine. And she was perfectly fine. You see, though there was a pause, nothing was ultimately lost. Nothing was ultimately lost. Because whatever sickness that girl had had that caused her to die, it was gone. Jairus had come to faith in Christ. The woman with the issue of blood was healed. God's glory was manifested before many lost people who needed to see how powerful he was. The disciples he brought with him witnessed it, and their faith grew as they learned more about the Lord. And that's just all that we know about. That's just all that we know about. What was the reason for the pause? There's lots of reasons. There's lots of things that God was doing, and I'm sure I've missed things that even he's told us about right here. But I think this is an important lesson for us. Because probably every single one of us in some way, we're in the midst of a pause right now. A pause between a request that we've made of the Lord, a burden that we're carrying, and the fulfillment of that. That thing that we desire, that thing that we need, that thing that we long for. We're in the midst of a pause, and sometimes it can get really, really hard. But what I want us to see by what Jesus did here, right, is that there's purpose. That there is purpose, that there are good things that he is trying to accomplish, even though we don't always see it and perceive it. But there will be that day when he will make all things new, when he will restore what is broken and all of that, and we will not have lost a thing. As he told his disciples when he sent them forth to go into dangerous places and preach the gospel and told them all these things that might befall them, including losing their lives, he also said, not a hair of your head will be lost in this. And it's not because they wouldn't die, and it's not because they wouldn't suffer, but because he ultimately would restore all things. And that is the promise. In the midst of the pause, there is a purpose, and there is a promise of restoration. And that is the hope of the glory of the gospel of Jesus Christ that we profess. And, you know, one day, just like, and I believe this, I don't feel it like I want to feel it like right now, but I do believe this. This is my hope. And not just like I wish, but it's something I expect. I expect a day will come when I will look back on the other side and say, you knew exactly what you were doing. And everything suffered, every difficulty, you knew what you were doing. And there was glorious purpose. And on the other side, I'm better off than I ever was before. And do you believe that? And is that your hope? Because that is the glory of our good God. That is the glory of our good God, who not only tells us there's a purpose, he gives us promises in his scripture. Great, precious promises that by these promises we might live this Christian life and endure and trust him. And he is worth it. And may we see him more as he brings us to those places of brokenness where we come before him in ashes and we bury our face in the ground and we cry out to him. May we find him there and present and giving us strength for what we need, whether it's to realize the promise in that moment or whether it's to press on in the pause until we get there. May we find his presence and his goodness and his promises sufficient for us to keep going and not to grow weary. Because Satan will tempt us to get tired. He will tempt us to give up. He will tempt us to believe that there is no hope. And that's what he does. But my friends, this is why we come together, right? We come together to exhort and to remind and to encourage each other while it's called today. That we wouldn't be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin, but that we would trust and exalt our Christ more deeply, more richly. We remind each other. I get encouraged to hang on when I'm with God's people. When I hear you rejoice, when I hear you tell about what Jesus is doing in your life. I mean, that just lifts all of us up. And so I want to encourage all of us to just be obedient to the Lord, to follow what he'd have us to do, to not fail to share and to praise and to profess all that God is doing in your life, because it may be exactly what somebody else needs to hear. That we wouldn't get weary in this time of waiting. Because a lot of us are just waiting. But it's okay. God bless you tonight. Let's have a song this evening. Let's stand and sing. And I just encourage you tonight to follow the Lord. Give him praise and honor.